I'm always pleased when Reverend Shue invites me to preach at St. Mark's, but I must admit to having been somewhat disconcerted when I saw that the gospel reading for today was Mark's account of Jesus' transfiguration. Looking back, I remember preaching on Luke's version of the same incident on Transfiguration Sunday in 2017, and it was difficult. I wasn't sure I could think of anything more to say about this story that might be helpful in 2021. But while studying the 9th chapter of Mark, I saw something I hadn't noticed before that may be important. I'm not sure I'm right, but I think it's worth sharing this morning to see what you think. One of my difficulties over the years as a practicing Christian has been loving God. I suspect this may be secretly true for many of us. I know it may sound shocking, but think about it. As humans, we usually love the people we experience in flesh and blood. People inhabiting the physical world we share. Loving an abstract God, or even a historic figure like Jesus, whom we believe was God incarnate, is not so easy, even with the help of the Holy Spirit. Contemplative prayer can place us in God's loving presence, but reading the Bible often presents us with unlovable portrayals of Yahweh, particularly in the Hebrew Scriptures, and even Jesus, such as those in John's Revelation. Groups and classes of people whom we should love are also difficult to love in the abstract aggregate. The poor, the hungry, strangers, widows, orphans, children. While training as a young doctor in the mid-1970s, I knew I should love my patients, particularly children. And I think I did a pretty good job of doing so. But in 1979, when my own first flesh and blood child was born, and I looked into her luminescent blue eyes, something different happened. I can't explain it, but I experienced love in a whole new way, not just for her, but for other children as well. I think Jesus' disciples had a similar experience during his transfiguration. Luke's gospel tells us that they had gone up on the mountain to pray, and that while Jesus was praying, his appearance was radically changed. All three synoptic gospels also say that Moses and Elijah appeared and talked with him. Peter, not knowing what to say, blurted out something relatively inappropriate about making dwellings for all three. Then, according to Mark, God said from the cloud overshadowing them, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. Only Jesus. They couldn't explain it, but they now saw the familiar Jesus, whom they loved, standing in front of them differently. I think they began to understand, perhaps for the first time, that their relationship with God was not primarily about the history of their people, Israel, the heroes of their past, the mighty acts of God in their scriptures, or their own messianic expectations, but about this flesh and blood human in whom God was incarnate, his love for them and their love for him. After this event, Mark says Jesus began telling his disciples even more explicitly that he, like the new Elijah, John the Baptist, would soon suffer and die. He also told them he would be raised from the dead, which they did not understand, but he knew he would not stay with them as the physical, human Jesus they had come to love. how would they continue to love him and through him God without his physical presence? Clearly, community worship, particularly singing and the celebration of the Eucharist, would become important to Jesus' followers in this regard. But I think Jesus hinted at other ways they would continue to experience his presence in love. Later in the same chapter which describes Jesus' transfiguration, Mark tells us the following story. Then they came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child, put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." In the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus likens God's judgment to a separation of sheep and goats. In this metaphor, the judging king has the following dialogue with the righteous. "Come, you that are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." The righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" King will answer them, "Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me." Could Jesus have been suggesting that when we act in love toward other flesh and blood humans, welcoming children, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, welcoming the stranger, clothing the naked, caring for the sick, and visiting the imprisoned, that we not only do it to Jesus, but also that we are able to experience and express the same kind of love that the disciples had for the flesh and blood human Jesus and the God who was incarnate in him. Mother Teresa has been quoted as saying, "I see Jesus in every human being. I say to myself, this is hungry Jesus, I must feed him. This is sick Jesus. The one has leprosy this one has leprosy or gangrene. I must wash him and tend him. I serve because I love Jesus." I would hope that in so doing she also experienced loving Jesus, just as his disciples did when he was physically present with them, as she served his children, the suffering flesh and blood humans who were physically present to her. I hope this might be true for all of us. Let's give it a whirl.